This is part 25 of Good Omens. Anathema had been looking at the clock. He'll be coming around any moment now, she thought. And then, when he got here, he wasn't what she'd been expecting. More precisely, he wasn't what she'd been hoping for. She had been hoping, rather self-consciously, for someone tall, dark, and handsome. Newt was tall, but with a rolled-out, thin look. And while his hair was undoubtedly dark, it wasn't any sort of fashion accessory. It was just a lot of thin black strands all growing together out of the top of his head. This was not Newt's fault. In his younger days, he would go every couple of months to the barber shop on the corner, clutching a photograph he'd carefully torn from a magazine, which showed someone with an impressively cool haircut grinning at the camera, and he would show the picture to the barber and ask to be made to look like that, please. And the barber, who knew his job, would take one look and then give Newt the basic all-purpose short back and sides. After a year of this, Newt realized they obviously didn't have the face that went with haircuts. The best Newt and Pulsifer could hope for after a haircut was shorter hair. It was the same with suits. The clothing hadn't been invented that would make him look suave and sophisticated and comfortable. These days he had learned to be satisfied with anything that would keep the rain off and give him somewhere to keep his change. And he wasn't handsome, not even when he took off his glasses. Actually, less so when he took off his glasses, because then he tripped over things and wore bandages a lot. And she discovered when she took off his shoes to lay him on her bed, he wore odd socks, one blue one with a hole in the heel and one gray one with holes around the toes. I suppose I'm meant to feel a wave of warm, tender female something or other about this, she thought. I'd wish he'd just washed them. So, tall, dark, but not handsome. She shrugged. Okay, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. The figure on the bed began to stir, and Anathema, who, in the very nature of things, always looked to the future, suppressed her disappointment and said, "How are we feeling now?" Newt opened his eyes. He was laying in a bedroom, and it wasn't his. He knew this instantly because of the ceiling. His bedroom ceiling still had the model aircraft hanging from bits of cotton. He'd never gotten around to taking them down. This ceiling just had cracked plaster. Newt had never been in a woman's bedroom before, but he sensed that this was one largely by a combination of soft smells. There was a hint of talcum and lily of the valley, and no rank suggestion of old t-shirts that had forgotten what the inside of a tumble dryer looked like. He tried to lift his head up, groaned, and let it sink back onto the pillow. Pink, he couldn't help noticing. "You banged your head on the steering wheel," said the voice that had roused him. "Nothing broken, though. What happened?" Newt opened his eyes again. "Carl, right?" he said. Apparently, a little voice inside it keeps repeating, "Please to fasten seatbelt." "See," said Newt to an invisible audience. They knew exactly how to build them in those days. That plastic finish hardly takes a dent. He blinked at Anathema. "I tried to swerve to avoid a Tibetan in the road," he said. "At least I think I did. I think I've probably gone mad." The figure walked around into his line of sight. It had dark hair and red lips and green eyes, and it was almost certainly female. Newt tried not to stare. It said, "If you have, no one's going to notice." Then she smiled. "Do you know, I've never met a witchfinder before." Newt began. She held up his open wallet. I had to look inside, she said. Newt felt extremely embarrassed. A not unusual state of affairs. Shadwell had given him an official witchfinder's warrant card, which, among other things, charged all beadles, magistrates, bishops, and bailiffs to give him free passage and as much dry kindling as he required. It was incredibly impressive, a masterpiece of calligraphy, and probably quite old. He'd forgotten about it. "It's really just a hobby," he said wretchedly. "I'm really he wasn't going to say wages clerk. Not here, not now, not to a girl like this." "A computer engineer," he lied. Want to be. In my heart, I'm a computer engineer. It's only the brain that's letting me down." "Excuse me, could I know—" "Anathema device," said Anathema. "I'm an occultist, but that's just a hobby. I'm really a witch." "Well done, you're half an hour late," she added, handing him a small sheet of cardboard. "So you'd better read this. It'll save a lot of time." Newt did, in fact, own a small home computer despite his boyhood experiences. In fact, he'd owned several. He always knew which ones he owned. They were desktop equivalents of the Wasabi. They were the ones which, for example, dropped to half price just after he bought them, or were launched in a blaze of publicity and disappeared into obscurity within a year, or only worked at all if you stuck them in a fridge. Or, if by some fluke they were basically good machines, Newt always got the few that were sold with the early bug-infested version of the operating system. But he persevered because he believed. Adam also had a small computer. He used it for playing games, but never for very long. He'd load a game, watch it intently for a few minutes, and proceed to play it until the high score counter ran out of zeros. When the other them wondered about this strange skill, Adam professed mild amazement that everyone didn't play video games like this. All you have to do is learn how to play it, and then it's just easy, he said. Quite a lot of the front parlor in Jasmine Cottage was taken up, Newt noticed with a sinking feeling, with piles of newspapers. Clippings were stuck around the walls. Some of them had bits circled in red ink. He was mildly gratified to spot several he had cut out for Shadwell. Anathema owned very little in the way of furniture. The only thing she'd bothered to bring with her had been her clock, one of the family heirlooms. It wasn't a full-case grandfather clock, but a wall clock with a free-swinging pendulum that E.A. Poe would cheerfully have strapped someone under. Newt kept finding his eye drawn to it. It was built by an ancestor of mine, said Anathema, putting the coffee cups down on the table. Sir Joshua Device. You may have heard him. He invented the little rocking thing that made it possible to build accurate clocks cheaply. They named it after him. The Joshua? Said Newt guardedly. The Device. In the last half hour, Newt had heard some pretty unbelievable stuff and was close to believing it, but you have to draw the line somewhere. The Device is named after a real person, he said. Oh, yes. Fine old Lancashire name. From the French, I believe. You'll be telling me next you've never heard of Sir Humphrey Gadget. Oh, now come on. Who devised a gadget that made it possible to pump out flooded mine shafts? Or Peter Gizmo? Or Cyrus T. Doodad, America's foremost black inventor? Thomas Edison said that the only other contemporary practical scientists he admired were Cyrus T. Doodad and Ella Reader Widget. And she looked at Newt's blank expression. I did my Ph.D. on them, she said. The people who invented things so simple and universally useful that everyone forgot that they'd ever actually needed to be invented. Sugar? You normally have two, said Anathema sweetly. Newt stared back at the card she'd handed him. She seemed to think it would explain everything. It didn't. It had a ruled line down the middle. On the left-hand side was a short piece of what seemed to be poetry in black ink. On the right-hand side, in red ink this time, were comments and annotations. The effect was as follows. 3819. When Orient's chariot invented be, 4 wheels in the sky, a man with bruises be upon your bed, aching his head for willow fine. A man whose test with a pine, yet his heart be clean, yet seed of mine own undoing, take the means of flame from him, for to mark right certain, together ye shall be until the end is to come. Japanese car, upturned. Car smash, not serious. Injury, take in. Willow fine equals aspirin. CF3757, pin equals witchfinder. CF102, good witchfinder, refers to pulsifer. CF002, search for matches, etc. In the 1990s, less than a day. CF712, 3803, 4004. Newt's hand went automatically to his pocket. His cigarette lighter had gone. What's this mean? He said hoarsely. Have you ever heard of Agnes Nutter? Said Anathema. No, said Newt, taking a desperate defense in sarcasm. You're going to tell me she invented mad people, I suppose. Another fine old Lancashire name, said Anathema coldly. If you don't believe, read up on the witch trials of the early 17th century. She was an ancestress of mine. As a matter of fact, one of your ancestors burned her alive, or tried to. Newt listened in fascinated horror to the story of Agnes Nutter's death. Thou shalt not commit adultery, Pulsifer, he said when she'd finished. That sort of name was quite common in those days, said Anathema. Apparently there were 10 children, and they were a very religious family. There was covetous Pulsifer, false witness Pulsifer. I think I understand, said Newt. Gosh, I thought Shadwell said he'd heard the name before. It must be the army records. I suppose if I'd gone around being called adultery Pulsifer, I'd want to hurt as many people as possible. I think he just didn't like women very much. Thanks for taking it so well, said Newt. I mean, he must have been an ancestor. There aren't many Pulsifers. Maybe that's why he sort of met up with the Witchfinder army. Could be fate, he said hopefully. She shook her head. No, she said. No such thing. Anyway, witch-finding isn't like it was in those days. I don't even think old Shadwell's ever done more than kick over Doris Stokes' dustbins. Between you and me, Agnes was a bit of a difficult character, said Anathema vaguely. She had no middle gears. Newt waved up the bit of paper. But what's it got to do with this, he said. She wrote it. Well, the original. It's number 319 of the Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Nutter, first published 1655. Newt stared at the prophecy again. His mouth opened and shut. She knew I'd crash my car? He said. Yes. No. Probably not. It's hard to say. You see, Agnes was the worst prophet that's ever existed, because she was always right. That's why the book never sold. Most psychic abilities are caused by a simple lack of temporal focus, and the mind of Agnes Nutter was so far adrift in time that she was considered pretty mad even by the standards of 17th century Lancashire, where mad prophetess were a growth industry. But she was a treat to listen to, everyone agreed. She used to go on about curing illnesses by using a sort of mold, and the importance of washing your hands so that the tiny little animals who caused diseases would be washed away, when every sensible person knew that a good stink was the only defense against the demons of ill health. She advocated running at a sort of gentle, bouncing trot as an aid to living longer, which is extremely suspicious, and first put the witchfinders onto her, and stressed the importance of fiber in diet, although here she was clearly ahead of her time, since most people were less bothered about the fiber in their diets than the gravel, and she wouldn't cure warts. It is all in your mind, she'd say. Forget about it, and it'll go away. It was obvious that Agnes had a line to the future, but it was an unusually narrow and specific line. In other words, almost totally useless. How do you mean? Said Newt. She managed to come up with a different kind of predictions that you can only understand after the thing has happened, said Anathema. Like, do not buy Betamax. That was a prediction for 1972. You mean she predicted videotape recorders? No, she just picked up one little fragment of information, said Anathema. That's the point. Most of the time she comes up with such an oblique reference that you couldn't work it out until it's gone past, and then it all slots into place. And she didn't know what was going to be important or not, so it's all a big hit and miss. Her prediction for November 26, 1963 was about a house falling down in King's Lynn. Oh? Newt looked politely blank. President Kennedy was assassinated, said Anathema helpfully. But Dallas didn't exist then, you see, whereas King's Lynn was quite important. Oh. She was generally very good if her descendants were involved. Oh? And she wouldn't know anything about the internal combustion engine. To her, they were just funny chariots. Even my mother thought it referred to an emperor's carriage overturning. You see, it's not enough to know what the future is, you have to know what it means. Agnes was like someone looking at a huge picture down a tiny little tube. She wrote down what seemed like good advice based on what she understood of the tiny little glimpses. Sometimes you can be lucky, Anathema went on. My great-grandfather worked out about the stock market crash of 1929, for example, 2 days before it actually happened. Made a fortune. You could say we're professional descendants. She looked sharply at Newt. You see, what no one ever realized until about 200 years ago is that the Nice and Accurate Prophecies was Agnes's idea of a family heirloom. Many of the prophecies relate to her descendants and their well-being. She was sort of trying to look after us after she'd gone. That's the reason for the King's Lynn prophecy, we think. My father was visiting there at the time, so from Agnes's point of view, while he was unlikely to be struck by stray rounds from Dallas, there was a good chance he might be hit by a brick. "What a nice person," said Newt. "You could almost overlook her blowing up an entire village." Anathema ignored this. "Anyway, that's about it," she said. "Ever since then, we've made it our job to interpret them. After all, it averages out at about one prophecy a month. More now, in fact, as we get closer to the end of the world." "And when is that going to be?" said Newt. Anathema looked meaningfully at the clock. He gave a horrible little laugh that he'd hoped sounded suave and worldly. After the event so far today, he wasn't feeling very sane, and he could smell Anathema's perfume, which made him uncomfortable. "Think yourself lucky I don't need a stopwatch," said Anathema. "We've got, about 5 or 6 hours. Newt turned this over in his mind. Thus far in his life, he'd never had the urge to drink alcohol, but something told him there had to be a first time. "Do witches keep drink in the house?" he ventured. "Oh, yes." She smiled the sort of smile Agnes Nutter probably smiled when unpacking the contents of her lingerie drawer. "Green bubbly stuff with strange things squirming on the congealing surface. You should know that." "Fine. Got any ice?" It turned out to be gin. There was ice. Anathema, who had picked up witchcraft as she went along, disapproved of liquor in general, but approved of it in her specific case. "Did I tell you about the Tibetan coming out of a hole in the road?" Newt said, relaxing a bit. "Oh, I know about them," she said, shuffling off the papers on the table. "The 2 of them came out of the front lawn yesterday. The poor things were quite bewildered, so I gave them a cup of tea, and then they borrowed a spade and went down again. I don't think they quite know what they're supposed to be doing." Newt felt slightly aggrieved. "How did you know they were Tibetan?" he asked. "If it comes to that, how did you know? Did he go, when you hit him?" "Well, he looked Tibetan," said Newt. "Saffron robes, bald head, Tibetan. One of mine spoke quite good English. It seems that one minute he was repairing radios in Lhasa, next minute he was in a tunnel. He doesn't know how he's going to get home. If you'd sent him up the road, he could probably have got a lift on a flying saucer," said Newt gloomily. 3 aliens? One of them a little tin robot? They landed on your lawn too, did they?" "It's about the only place they didn't land, according to the radio. They keep coming down all over the world delivering a short, trite message of cosmic peace, and when people say, 'Yes, well,' they give him a blank look and take off again. Signs and portents, just like Agnes said." "You're going to tell me she predicted all this too, I suppose." Agnes leafed through a battered card index in front of her. "I kept meaning to put it all on computer," she said. "Word searches and so forth, It'd make it a lot simpler. The prophecies are arranged in any old order, but there are clues handwriting and so." "She did it all in a card index?" said Newt. "No, a book, but I've, mislaid it. You always had copies, of course." "Lost it, eh?" said Newt, trying to inject some humor into proceedings. "Bet she didn't foresee that." Anathema glowered at him. If looks could kill, Newt would have been on a slab. Then she went on. "We've built up quite a concordance over the years, though. My grandfather came up with a useful cross-referencing system. Here we are." She pushed a sheet of paper in front of Newt. 3988. "When men of Chorus come to the earth, and green men from the sky, yet ken not why, and Pluto's bars quite the lightning castles, and sunken lands riseth, and Leviathan runneth 3, and Brazil is vert, then 3 cometh together, and 4 arise upon iron horses ride. I tell you, the end draweth nigh. Crocus equals saffron, CF2003. Aliens, paratroops, nuclear power stations, sea cuttings, NOS 798 through 806, Atlantis cuttings 812 through 819, Leviathan equals whale, CF 1981, South America is green, 3 equals 4, railways, iron road, CF 2675. "I didn't get all of this one in advance," Anathema admitted. "I filled it in after listening to the news." "You must be incredibly good at crosswords in your family," said Newt. "I think Agnes is getting a bit out of their depth here anyway. The bits about Leviathan and South America and 3s and 4s could mean anything," she sighed. "The problem is newspapers. You never know if Agnes is referring to some tiny little incident that you might miss. Do you know how long it takes to go through every daily paper thoroughly every morning? 3 hours and 10 minutes, said Newt automatically.